The Iowa caucuses seem to be a cakewalk for Trump, a landslide for Trump, etc. How could you possibly, his nomination to the GOP top of ticket spot seems, a foregone conclusion. How could you not be so impressed with that and find anything at all to concern Trump in those numbers?
Well, I've put out on my Twitter feed and threads alternative headlines to what the New York Times and the LA Times had, because I don't see this as a great victory. Only 1 in 13 registered Republican voters in Iowa voted for Donald Trump yesterday. 1 in 13. And by the way, 1 in 12 and a half voted for anybody else. That is not super strong support. Now, we don't know how many of the people who voted for DeSantis, Haley, etc., will never vote for Trump. But this morning on NPR, Frank Luntz, the pollster, whose work I've cited in the past, he's very good. He suggested that half of the DeSantis voters, so that would be 10% of the total voters in the caucus, will not vote for Trump. They may stay home. They may vote for a third-party candidate. They may vote for Biden. But 1 in 13 is not very good. And by the way, the turnout last night was down 40% from 2016, 111,000 voters instead in the Republican caucus instead of 180,000 8 years ago. And despite the cold weather, which people in Iowa are used to in the winter, there are journalists who reported that bars and bowling alleys and restaurants were doing gangbuster business Monday night. So it suggests that Trump's cult is rabidly behind him, but everywhere else the support is weak. And we'll know a lot more about this next week when the primary is held in New Hampshire, a very different state. Fair amount of libertarian leanings, a much smaller faux Christian group. Iowa is very high in the number of evangelicals who I call faux Christians because what they believe in often has nothing to do with what's in the New Testament. And in some ways, better educated population in New Hampshire. So I think next week will be very telling about the breadth of Trump's support.
It's interesting to hear you say that because the horse race part of elections, I make this point specifically for our audience here because I think it's really something to keep in mind moving forward. You're really pointing to numbers that we should be focused on, how many people turned out, how many people actually said, or what can we tell about their possible leanings and tendencies toward voting for Trump in a general election? Because even if you grant the fact that this guy is going to cakewalk his way into being the GOP top of ticket candidate, you have to look to the general. And so much focus has been on the poor performance numbers that Biden has. But actually, you're saying, hey, look at these numbers. These are kind of poor electoral performance numbers potentially for Trump moving forward to the general.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I kept looking for were stories where people dug into what you will do if Trump is not the nominee. And I think it's just too early for most people to have thought about this. I was also struck, I spent a couple of hours wasting time, I suppose, over the weekend, looking at videos from a number of sources of interviews with Trump supporters in Iowa. Many of them were quite young, and I was surprised, just absolutely flabbergasted at how badly informed they were. A number of them insisted that, of course, Trump won in 2020, that Joe Biden is a dictator, that the economy has gone to hell in a handbasket, that there aren't any jobs, things that just have no connection to reality. And I think this is a big problem. The founders of this country were very concerned, and the reason the Constitution is created in such a way as to make it very difficult to change. They were very concerned about a mob mentality. The founders all knew their ancient Greek history, and the first Western democracy in Athens 2,500 years ago, people were split up. There was a change of leadership every a couple of months. There were 10 months in the year, and every 10th of the year, there was a change in who was in charge. And each block had not just a single clan, it had 3 clans, so that it made power much more diffuse, made it very hard to make change. And that's what was built into our Constitution. It's not, we can have change, but it's not easy.
So it's interesting, David. I'm seeing this in the chat that many people are looking at Nikki Haley, strong candidate, and certainly it looks you'd expect her to run more strongly in New Hampshire for some of the reasons that you've noted. But it seems on the Republican side, for reasons that you've also just kind of referenced, cult of personality. Democrats spend a lot of time looking at issues. It seems the GOP side is looking for leadership, and it doesn't really matter how troubled that leader might be. I mean, Trump certainly has to be one of the most complex, troubled leaders in American history.
Now, I think you're quite right about that. I mean, human beings are largely herd animals. They follow leaders. You can love Ronald Reagan or hate him, but he was a leader. He changed the country, killed the New Deal, and sent us in a whole other direction toward government of, by, and for the rich. A lot of people just see Trump as someone, well, he'll take care of it. He's our savior. God anointed him. If he's not a God himself, and we just let him do things, and then we don't have to do the hard work of being a citizen. And I noticed in the chat, a person asked, I thought, a pretty interesting question. That is, why isn't Biden on the primary in New Hampshire next week? And I think they just made a strategic decision that it wasn't a useful use of their resources. He's going to be the Democratic Party nominee. And similarly, and I think this is somewhat arrogant, but Biden is supremely confident that he knows what he's doing, and he doesn't want to start campaigning too soon. He doesn't want things to become old news. On the other side of this, the news media side, it's just atrocious to see all of the mistakes of 2016 being repeated. I'm in a forum with a lot of retired New York Times editors, reporters, photographers, copy editors, and there's a fair amount of discussion about how one day in the past couple of days, the online front page had 6 stories about Trump and not a single mention of Biden. And I've noticed an increasing tendency in coverage on cable TV for references to President Trump instead of former President Trump. And I think those are all very troubling. You got to pay attention to the basics. Bill Clinton is not President Clinton. He's former President Clinton.
Sure. It's funny when they walk into a room, though, David, just on that point, former governors, former secretaries of state, former presidents, you do address them by the title, don't you?
I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't for a very simple reason, Mark. When I was exposing the LAPD 40 years ago, I was the first reporter to systematically look and show that its reputation was nonsense. They weren't solving crimes. They were running a worldwide political spying operation, etc. I had an officer I had great respect for say to me, "Why don't you call him Chief?" And Daryl Gates. And I said, right. Well, if I were a police officer, I would call him Chief Gates because he's my boss. But Daryl and I are citizens of the city of Los Angeles, and we are equals. We just have different jobs. So he's Daryl to me, and he calls me David.
Yes, and of course, as we know, and you've kind of reframed the conversation when you talk about Trump, you always call him Donald. Yep. Does Biden, it's asked in our chat, and then I want to get to Boeing. This is a very big story with Boeing. Randy asked, does Biden have the number of apparently rabid voters that Trump does?
I don't think he has that many rabid voters. I don't think anybody finds Joe Biden to be charismatic at all. He's highly competent. He knows how Washington works. With the same vote margin the Republicans had until just recently, 5 votes. In fact, I think they only had 4. During his first 2 years, he got these major pieces of legislation enacted. He's appointed more judges in his 3 years than I think any president's ever appointed in 4 years. We have a whole series of things going on that show that this is a guy who knows what he's doing. And I think one of the most damaging things that's happened to the country is that we've had all of these amateurs in the White House. Bill Clinton never served in Washington until he became president. He was governor of a very small state. George H.W. Bush, an incredibly incurious man with extraordinary limited experience and knowledge, surrounded by a whole bunch of neocons who, the very first cabinet meeting, laid out a plan to attack Iraq and seize its oil, as the then Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill revealed in his book. Barack Obama, became a U.S. senator because the Republicans had a lock on getting that seat until someone leaked to one of the Chicago newspapers a story, and a judge released the divorce records showing that Mr. Ryan, the family values candidate, wanted his wife, the actress Jerry Ryan, to go to sex clubs and have sex with other men in front of him. And that was the end of Ryan. And so this guy, Barack Obama, who got to run because the Democrats thought there's no way we win, becomes a senator, goes to Washington, has a cup of coffee, and is president of the United States. We should always remember, thank you, Jerry Ryan, or we wouldn't, and your divorce, or we wouldn't have had Barack Obama as president. And then we get Donald Trump, who never did a day of public service in his life before January 20th of 2017. In Biden, we have somebody who's an experienced Washington hand and knows how the system works, just as Lyndon B. Johnson did, to some degree, Richard Nixon did. But, like Jimmy Carter, he didn't know anything about how to run Washington, and it ran him.
Yeah, he was such a brilliant guy, but yeah, I think that's exactly right. He was like
man who's ever been in the White House, but, not effectual.
I'm sorry, I just want to get to some of these questions for you before we get to the.
I do want to get to Boeing. Is really important.
Yeah, I'm going to. Well, this is all about the cult of Trump and how small it is. This speaks to that, and then I will get to a question, and then
somebody I see put in there that President Trump is the proper form of address. No, it's not. He's former President Trump. You address the president if you're going to be formal as Mr. President. You do not address a former president as Mr. President.
The reference to Charles Manson having followers, Jim Jones having followers, and just because he attracts this base that's so animated doesn't mean that they are going to be a majority. She contends, Laura does, that it's going to be a minority. But the other point that was made here, I can't find the actual. Here it is. Donald says. I already said this, but I'm very worried that a few thousand people in the swing states can force a dictatorship on hundreds of millions of people. Can David talk about this scary thought?
That is a very scary and reasonable thought. Michelle Obama at one point was noting that Barack Obama, 1,000 votes made a difference in some jurisdictions where he was voting or around that. Every vote counts. It's necessary to get out the vote. At the end of the day, all that matters in democracy is who actually voted. And Donald Trump, if he's the nominee, as expected now, will lose the popular vote. In fact, I've said in a variety of forums, including your show, he will lose by at least 10 million votes. But that doesn't mean he can't get back into the White House. There are 13 states that can go either way. And you could win those by the narrowest of margins. That's what happened in 2016. Donald lost the popular vote by more than 3 million. The next election was more than 7. But he won the Electoral College because we don't elect the president directly, and we give this enormous power to little states. So states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, there really needs to be a huge effort to turn out the vote by people who don't want Donald Trump. Whether you like Biden or not, the reality is it's going to be Biden running for the Democrats, and your choice is Joe Biden or the end of American democracy. I mean, I don't think that's a difficult test. And anybody who thinks that, no, that's not true, Donald Trump will not do that. He announced he's going to be a dictator for one day. I don't know anybody who's a dictator who gave up being a dictator until they died, whether by natural causes or being overthrown. I would encourage people to go watch the movie The Death of Stalin, a black comedy about what happened when Stalin died that has a lot of truth in it. The best fiction is truth distilled from the specific facts. By the way, if you want to go to a great entertaining movie, go see American Fiction starring Jeffrey Wright. It is the first perfect movie my wife and I have ever seen. Perfect
Wow.
acting, perfect script, perfect cast, perfect directing, lighting, music, cinematography. It's a very enjoyable movie. It's about a serious subject, but you'll laugh and you'll smile and you'll walk out feeling good. And it's absolutely fascinating movie.
Well, I hate feeling good, but all right. I mean, in these troubled times, maybe I'll try it for a minute or two. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.